It was just supposed to be another camping trip, like so many others we had gone on before. The town we live in isn't huge, but it does have a lot of woodland to explore. We live on the edge of what most people call Appalachia, and we've had more than one weird experience out in the woods. Once, as my friends and I walked down a familiar trail, we smelled a strong and unpleasant scent. Brian thought it must be a bear, but I'd smelled bears before. We'd had one winter under our back porch one year, and this was very different than the musty smell he had left come spring. Another time, while we were camping, we saw ghost lights in the woods. They were beautiful, red and blue and yellow and orange, and though Justin was afraid of them, I felt drawn to go and see them so I could see them better. I knew better, though. Grandma had told me all about the dangers of following the ghost lights, and had assured us all that we wouldn't like where they took us.
The land of fairies is beautiful, but also terrible for mortals to behold. They would make you young for the rest of your days, though that might not be as long as you might think, she always said with an evil grin. We'd heard whistling and strange growls, throaty yells and strange birds, but none of it ever really scared me. The woods had always been a friendly place, a place of adventure, and I always looked forward to my time there. I never felt uneasy when I was within its borders, and as the four of us prepared to go back into the woods for another camping expedition, I was excited. Brian's brother had told us about an old trestle bridge deep in the woods, and we all wanted to see it. It was part of the old railroad, something that hadn't run through the town in a long time. The tracks were still there, the old station too, but the trains had mostly been for passengers, and we had none these days. No one came in, no one left, and we had no industry for the trains to transport. All the wood we harvested went to the sawmill or the paper mill, and there was no need to transport it by rails. The trestle bridge hadn't seen a train cross in 20 years. It spanned a small gorge in the middle of the forest. Brian said his brother had claimed the bridge was where high school kids went to drink beer, and now that we were freshmen, we should go out there too. He said it was a rite of passage, and that we should go see if the rite had decided to leave us a gift out there. We didn't know what sort of gift that would be, but we were all curious to see the bridge. So, we told our parents that we were going camping one weekend in April, and took to the woods. Brian and I were eager, talking about how cool it would be to see the bridge, but Justin and Frank seemed hesitant. Well, that wasn't quite true. Justin was hesitant, as he almost always was, and Frank was kind of ambivalent. We had met Frank last year at the start of 9th grade, and he had made a pretty good addition to our trio. Frank wasn't an avid hiker, but he liked to hang out in the woods and get a little high from time to time, and that was good enough for us. He also brought outstanding camp snacks, so we were more than happy to hit the trail with him. I wasn't certain there was a sleeping bag in that rucksack of his, but I could already hear the crinkle of chips and snack cakes within it. Any idea how far this bridge is?" Justin asked, plodding along grumpily. Justin didn't mind hiking, but he wasn't big on aimlessly wandering in the woods. He had packed enough to make up for Frank's lack of gear, and the tent poked over his left shoulder. He was plodding along at the back of the group, and I was sure we'd have to listen to a fair amount of complaints before we got there. "My brother says it's about 3 miles into the woods, following the river until we come to the gorge. After that, it should be pretty easy to find." "And if your brother's playing a trick on us, if he's just, messing with us, and we walked for 3 hours into the woods for nothing?" Brian rolled his eyes. "Then we have a fun little adventure to talk about when we go to college, don't we?" Justin grumbled about having to walk 3 miles into the woods, but he couldn't have picked a better day for it. The weather was perfect, a slight breeze keeping the early summer heat at bay. The clouds overhead looked a little wet, but they were nowhere close. We'd have a nice camping trip this weekend.
a nice little excuse to fish and relax and enjoy ourselves as we explored the old Trestle. The woods around the town were full of things like that, and we'd explored old houses that had been retaken by the underbrush or abandoned vehicles that sagged amongst the leaves. When we were in the 7th grade, we even found an old concrete culvert out there that led into an underground cave that looked a little spooky in the light of our flashlights. The farther we walked, however, the less certain I was that the clouds wouldn't be a problem. The deeper into the woods we went, the more the smell of rain surrounded us. Brian smelled it too, and our pace increased as we kept heading deeper in. Maybe it was just a little rain. Maybe it was just a short downpour, and maybe we could get past it before it soaked everything. When we came to the gorge and I saw the rising skeletal edifice of the Trestle, I breathed a sigh of relief. "There she is, boys," Brian said, sounding surprised to have found it at all. "Looks pretty wrecked," Frank said, tossing a stub of cigarette into the gorge. "We aren't actually gonna go up on that thing, are we?" "Well, yeah," Brian said. "That's kind of the only reason we came here, wasn't it?" "You might, but I don't care what kind of surprise is up there," Frank said. "I ain't going." He had plenty of time to rethink his statement. Just because we had found the gully didn't mean we had made it to the Trestle. The closer we got, the more I could see that for its age, it really was in amazing shape. It was less skeletal than I had thought, and looked more like a covered metal bridge. The underside of the Trestle was a dark cave, the shadows thick and deep, and I really didn't want to explore the underside unless we really had to. Something about it made me uncomfortable, and as we got closer and closer to the base, the whole thing seemed to grow. It was mid-afternoon when we finally made it, and Brian let his pack fall as he set about climbing at once. You don't want to set up camp first?" Justin asked, taking out his tent and tools for making fire. "I just want to see the woods from up there," Brian said, looking at me as if to ask if I was coming. I let my pack slide off too, and we climbed the side of the Trestle side by side. We were laughing as the ground got further and further away, the girders lifting us above the trees until we finally crested the top and came to the old tracks of the railroad. I was full of wonder as I looked out over the woods, the Trestle spanning the entire gorge before slanting back down to the woods again. From up here, the clouds looked very dark, and I wondered if the tent would be enough to keep us from getting wet. "Check this out," Brian said, dangling his feet over the edge as he looked down into the gorge. Watching him made me slightly dizzy, and I didn't dare join him on the precipice. When he came back up, however, he had a rope with him and nodded me over to help him pull it up. It wasn't really heavy, but we were careful not to let it get stuck on anything. Brian left me to pull so that he could look over the edge and reported that the rope was attached to an old red cooler. As it came up over the edge, I saw that the rope was attached to a handle, and the whole thing was the red of a kid's wagon left out in the sun. The box was ancient, the bystander of 1,000 summer outings, and there was something inside it. Brian opened the lid and smiled as he pulled out a lukewarm six-pack of Natty Ice, a brand I was passing familiar with. Dad, a staunch Budweiser man, had always shook his head and called it piss water when he saw that it was on sale. I figured, for a bunch of kids who were barely old enough to buy beer, the price was probably right, though. I assumed that Brian's brother had put it here. He had told us where to find the Trestle Bridge, after all, and as Brian fished the note out from under them, my suspicion was confirmed. "Brian, this is a place where high schoolers have come to drink and hang out for generations. Our own mom and dad sat on this bridge and drank when they were in high school, and now it's your turn. I spotted you a sixer this time, but you'll have to bring your own next time. If you ever have extra, leave them in this cooler and then tuck the cooler under the Trestle Bridge. Also, don't go under the bridge. We think there might be a bear under there. Kevin." The thought of a bear so close to our campsite kind of scared me, but Brian brushed it off. "He's probably just messing with us. Want one?" he asked, popping the top as he offered me one. I hesitated. I'd never drank before, but I figured just one couldn't kill me. It was warm and tasted terrible, but it wasn't the worst thing I'd ever had. Brian drank his quick, laughing as he threw the can into the gorge far below. We watched it spiraling down, spilling the last few remaining drops before it clinked weakly at the bottom. As if in answer, there was a distant rumble of thunder, and from our vantage point, we saw the lightning crack in the distance. We were on a big metal structure with lightning coming in quick and rain already pattering lightly around us. "We better go," I said, Brian looking at the lightning as it rumbled again. He nodded, and we decided to run down the tracks rather than try to scale back down. It would mean doubling back, but it wouldn't be a long trip, and the thought of juggling the rest of the beers and trying to climb down sounded nuts. Brian was holding the 4 of them close as he ran, smiling to himself as he talked about showing them to the guys. "Justin's gonna flip," Brian said with an evil laugh. "You know, he still won't even be around anyone who smokes because of that dumb dare pledge." He was right, too. Justin was furiously hammering in tent pegs when we arrived, looking up at the sky every time a drop hit him. He stopped when he noticed us come back with cans that clearly weren't soda. Frank must have recognized them because he laughed and commented that they had found a pretty cool surprise. Brian tossed him one, turning to Justin as he offered him one too. Justin put a hand on his hips, looking like my mom when she was disappointed in me. "Hell no, and you shouldn't either. Why would you just drink something you found on a rickety bridge?" Brian blew out a long breath and popped another one. "Because, Spaz, my brother left them for us. There was a note and everything, so cool your jets." Brian went back to work, mumbling darkly about being reckless and drinking things that could be poisoned or drugged. The tent came up, and not a moment too soon. The rain was really starting to come down, and it looked like there would be no fire tonight. We all headed into the tent, the wind picking up as it shoved the tent and made the ropes and pegs groan. It was big enough to fit all of us comfortably, and as the lamps came out, Brian held up the last 2 beers. "Split the last 2?" he asked, everyone but Justin agreeing. We poured them into our camp cups, starting to clink them together before Brian turned to Justin. He was pretending to busy himself with something in the corner, but it was pretty clear that he didn't approve of what we were doing. "Come on, Justin, it's not going to hurt you. I tell you what, if we see you becoming an alcoholic after 1 sip, I'll push you into the gorge and save you the embarrassment." "Not funny," Justin said, but he had clearly worn him down. After another half-hearted refusal, he finally held out his cup to Justin and grinned as he poured the last of the beer into it. Then he clinked his glass with the rest of us, and we drank, everyone pulling a face which we laughed at. As the storm raged outside and we ate some MREs that we had packed just in case of bad weather, we started on our ghost stories. Brian was just telling us about a man with a hungry ghost in his basement when a big gust of wind hit the tent hard enough to collapse the middle brace and send it crashing down on us. We floundered for a minute, looking for the zipper as we tried to escape, and finally stepping out into the driving rain. It was still afternoon, the sun an angry line amidst the storm clouds, and I turned as I heard someone struggling with the tent. Justin was trying to pull it, the wind threatening to take it from him with every gust. "Come on," he shouted. "Help me get it under the trestle. It should work as a windbreak." I remembered the warning about a bear, but Brian just shouted back that it was either the bear or the rain. "Besides," he said, "if we see one, we'll just run like hell." It was hard to argue with him while the rain was coming down, so we all grabbed a tent post and moved it into the dry cave created by the trestle. Unlike a lot of train trestles I had seen in movies and on TV, this one was enclosed. I'm still not sure why, but it worked out well for us that day. We knocked in the tent pegs and sat in the tent as we watched the rain come down in buckets outside. Our stuff had gotten a little wet, but we hadn't brought anything that couldn't take a little water. As the light gave way to dark, we started breaking out the lanterns and cards, settling in for the night as we listened to the rain. As I lay there watching Justin and Brian play their 4th or 5th game of Magic the Gathering, I started hearing something besides the rain. It was a deep rumbling, like something snoring deep under the metal bridge. I thought again about Brian's brother telling us there might be a bear under there. I didn't really want to get eaten by a bear in my sleep, and if we were going to have to move again, it was better to do it now. I took out my flashlight and started looking into the shadowy depths of the trestle, but there was nothing to be seen. There was some thick-looking mud under here, some of it having made little stalagmites on the ground, but I couldn't see anything sleeping under there. It Wouldn't make a very good den, I reflected as I shone my light around. It was open on both sides, with the gorge coming in about 30 feet from our tent. There was really nowhere for anything to live down here, but as I swung the light from left to right, I could still hear that weird breathing. On a whim, I pointed it up and under the bridge, and that was when I saw it. First I thought it was a bunch of bats clustered together, but when it flinched under the beam of my light, I knew it was just one big thing. It was a huge bat, way bigger than me, with its large leathery wings pulled up tight around it. It was clinging to the bottom of the trestle bridge, and I imagined that it had been a bad spot to hang when the trains were still in order. I spotted a slight movement to its left and found a second one, hanging not far from it. In total, there were 4 of them, and when one of them shifted its wings and looked at me with a red, unhappy eye, I turned off the flashlight and zipped up the tent. The guys had some strong words when I started turning off lanterns, but I told them to be quiet and get down. "What?" Frank asked. "Did you see something out there?"
Was it the bear?
Brian asked, keeping his voice low as we hunkered down.
What bear?
Justin asked, but I waved a hand at them, trying to get them to be quiet.
It's not a bear, I hissed.
But about that time, there was a weird sound from outside. It sounded like a high-pitched yawn as something came awake, followed by the rustle of wings. The talk in the tent had ceased now, and you could have heard a mouse fart. In the dark of the undercroft, we heard something huge and leathery take flight, rustling the canvas of the tent as it left the darkness. A second took flight a moment later, and I heard water cascade down as it shook the top of the trees. We all lay on our stomachs, panting for breath as we listened for more. I had seen 4, and only 2 had left so far. When something hit the ground about a foot from our tent, Justin had to slap a hand over his mouth to stop from screaming. The hushed remnant squeaked from between his fingers like a deflating balloon, but if the creature heard it, it never showed any sign. I could see the vague outline of it as it rose to its full height, and as it flapped its wings and took flight, the tent rustled like it had been in the wind.
"Is that all of them?"
Brian asked, 3 sets of eyes turning my way. I started to tell them that there had been a 4th, but that was when the 4th fell on top of the tent. We were all very lucky, all things considered. It landed right in the middle of the tent, shattering the plastic pole and sending the plastic material falling down around us. The creature's toenails scrambled across it noisily as it tried to find purchase, and when it took off, I was afraid it would simply carry us off with it. Instead, it just ripped a hole in the top as it flew off, and all of us were left reeling as we lay under the canvas. After a few minutes, it was decided that we would take our sleeping bags and our backpacks and leave the tent behind. We spent a miserable night huddled under the biggest tree we could find. We probably looked like fat caterpillars as we hunkered under the roots of that big tree, but we were as dry as could be managed. We all kept looking towards the skies, afraid the giant bat things would come after us, but they never did. We didn't talk, we didn't dare, and when the sun came up, we made our way out of the woods. We arrived at my house cold, scared, and unwilling to talk about what we had seen. My parents probably thought we had run afoul of something like a bear or a cougar, but they had no idea. That was about 2 weeks ago, and we haven't been back in the woods since. Just knowing that those things are in the woods makes us not want to be there after dark. It's a shame because the woods were our spot, our sanctuary, and now it seems tainted. Brian doesn't even leave the house after sunset these days, and Justin looks at the skies when he's walking. Frank says he doesn't really want to talk about it, and I think he's stoned a lot of the time. I dream about it sometimes, the way that big red eye looked at me when I shone my flashlight on it, and I can't help but wonder what something that big eats. I think it will be a good long time before I talk any of them back into the woods, and our camping days may be at an end. you're still here. Thanks so much for joining us for tonight's spooky tale. If you'd like a little bit more spooky in your life, why not click on one of the videos that appears at the end of our story, or maybe head on over to one of our playlists where you can get your fill of spooky content. If you like your spooky a little more tactile, I've got a new book that's come out. If you'd like your own copy, there's a link below in the description where you can get your own copy of my spooky book. If you like what you see here on the channel and think you might like to support in a more monetized way, then why not come over to Patreon or become a member on YouTube? Speaking of, let's go ahead and thank our members now. Thanks to Civ Garstead, Unicorn Hollow, and Army Dude for being our Spooky Ghost contributors. Thanks to Janet, Lee Kendall, Psycat, Rhonda J, Sue Casper, and Valinator for being our Spooky Skeleton contributors. And thanks to Oh Snap, Hi Stacy, Winter, Zeronin, Stephanie Carrington, Tyler Parker, Cinnamon Fox, Grim Reaper, Tomboy Top Uwu, and Queen Sheba for being our Ghostly Reader tier contributors. And a big thanks to Scott Donahue for being our Ghostly Writer tier contributor. Thanks, everyone. We just couldn't do the show without you. If you'd like to support the channel, then come on down to Patreon or become a member on YouTube. Spooky Skeleton tier contributors, that's our $5 tier, get their spooky 12 hours early at 8:30 a.m. as opposed to 8:30 p.m. My time, of course. And while Ghostly Reading is only a tier that's available on Patreon, you get a signed copy of my book anytime I write one on your doorstep in, hopefully, a timely manner. If you'd like a book, we have many on Amazon. I've got links below if you'd like to follow those. Should get you to my page so you can buy any one of my 8 books I believe we're up to now. I'm sure they'd look really nice on your shelf, and I'll sign them for you if you can find me out in the wild. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.